In the last video, we started pulling apart our new contract called inbox. We left off at the functions down here. Let's now continue by talking about some of the different functions and what they actually do. We'll first start off by taking a look at the syntax of the getMessage function. So here's the getMessage function. We're going to take a look at some of the different parts of the function declaration. We first start off with the function keyword and then the name of the function. There's no big requirements about the name of any given function with Solidity. Just remember common programming sense. We want to make sure that if anyone looks at a given function, it's at least somewhat clear as to what its purpose is. In this case, we called it getMessage because it gets and retrieves a message that is stored inside of our contract. And so I think the function name was pretty reasonably picked in this case. After the function name, we list out some different arguments that this function can be called with. In this case, getMessage did not accept any arguments, so we left this set of parentheses empty. However, if you take a look back at our setMessage function right here, you'll notice that we specified that this can be called with one argument. That argument had to be of a type string. If it was called with a string, then that string would be assigned to the variable newMessage, and we could then access that argument from within the body of the function right here. If we ever try calling setMessage with, say, an array or a number, then this function would throw an error, and it would tell us that we have to call it with specifically a string. After the function name and the argument list, we list out the function type. This is going to be a always changing number of words. So in other words, sometimes we're going to see public and view. Other times we'll see just the word public. And as a matter of fact, we just saw that a moment ago with our actual code. So you see right here we have public, over here public and view. So we're always going to have some number of words after the argument list. We refer to these as the function type declaration. There's a variety of different words that we're going to put in here. And let's talk about some of the most common ones that you're going to be using inside of your code. All right, so here's a list of the most common function types. There's maybe 2 function types that I did not list on here, but in general, you probably will not be using those other 2 very often. And I'll leave it up to you to do a little bit of research if you want to find out what they are. Honestly, just really stick to these for right now. We're going to look at all the different function types that we can specify, starting at the very top here. The first one is public. If we mark a function as being public, that means that anyone in the world can call this function. And when I say anyone, I mean anyone with an account. So anyone with an Ethereum account can access our contract and call a given function. Now this is not really used for implementing any type of security per se. So just putting the public word in there doesn't mean that, oh, all of a sudden our contract is accessible by everyone and completely open. And then if we put a different word, all of a sudden it's 100% secure. As opposed to public, we can mark a function as private. And that means that only our contract's code can call this function. Again, private doesn't really implement any level of security. Instead, you should think of public and private as communicating to other engineers as to whether or not they should be calling these functions at all. A good example of this would be maybe we put together a helper function. Maybe we make a helper function that just does some tiny little task that is very specific to our contract. And we only ever expect to call that function from within another function in our contract. That would be a good example of where we might want to use the private keyword. Notice that we can only use one of these per function. So a function is either public or private. In general, we're almost always going to be using the public keyword unless we are making very specifically a helper function, in which case we might use the private keyword. The next 2 keywords right here really may mean the same exact thing. So this term used to be called constant. In more recent versions of Solidity, they have updated the name to be view. In documentation, you're going to see sometimes constant and sometimes view. Again, they mean the same thing, and you can use them interchangeably. Using the view or constant keywords inside of the function declaration specifies whether or not that function modifies any of the contract's data. So let's take a look at an example of this. Let's go back to our code editor over here. So in our getMessage function right here, you'll notice that we are not attempting to modify the message variable in any way, shape, or form. We're not changing it. We're just accessing it. Because we are just accessing data inside the contract and we are not trying to modify or change it whatsoever, we are making use of the view keyword right here. This specifies to the Solidity compiler that this does not modify any of our data, and it actually changes the way in which we attempt to call this function, but we'll see an example of that very shortly. On the other hand, we can take a look at the setMessage function. In the case of setMessage, we clearly accept some argument and then update or modify the value of the data within our contract. So we are modifying the variable message right here. So this function right here would not be appropriate to mark as either view or constant because it is attempting to change our contract. The next function type is pure. Pure is very much like view and constant, but it goes one step further. A function marked as pure means that the function will not modify or even access the contract's data. In practice, I kind of expect you won't end up using pure that often, except out of some pretty interesting edge cases. Or, I don't know, I'm sure you could contrive a good example or two. But in general, I personally have not found many instances where I might want to use pure. Now the last keyword that we're going to cover, and this is one that we'll use quite a bit throughout this course, is the payable keyword. The payable keyword means that whenever some outside source or some outside entity, like you or me, attempts to call a function on a contract, payable means that we might attempt to call it and send money to the contract at the same time. We're going to end up using payable quite a bit because a lot of the contracts that you and I are going to write are going to attempt to accept money from people. So we're going to expect that people somehow access our contract, and at the same time they do, we might require that they pay us some money for the privilege of running our code, so to speak. Okay, so this has been an overview of some common function types. Now you don't really have to memorize all these from the get-go. I'm just trying to give you a sense of some of the different things that you can expect to see with the language. As time goes on, and as we start to write more and more code, I promise you I will be telling you all the different function names that we'll be using. Now the last thing I want to point out inside of here is the returns keyword down on the get message function. Returns is used to specify the type of return value that we can expect to see back from a function. Returns is only ever going to be used on functions that are marked as view or constant. So if a function is meant to modify the state of the contract, a function that modifies the state of the contract will not return any values. Now to be clear, we can attempt to return a value. So if I say return message and then returns string, you'll notice that we don't really get an error message here. And so that doesn't quite match up to what I just said about about functions that modify the contract data as not being able to return value. But in just a little bit, I'll show you an example of why we cannot actually return data from a function that modifies our contract. All right, I'm going to clean up that code really quickly, and we'll remove the returns right here as well. Cool. All right, so I think that completes a first overview of our inbox contract. But we still need to use the Remix tool quite a bit to figure out how we can run, deploy, and test out this contract. So let's pause right here. We'll continue the next video, and we'll get a better sense of how to use the Remix tool. So I'll see you in just a minute.